The first thing I noticed was that she didn't blink. It was a small thing, smaller than the clumsy etiquette of my cousins, smaller than the way the chandeliers trembled when the organ rose, but it lodged like a mote in my throat and would not be dislodged. We stood beneath the vaulting stone and the gaslight-silvered glass, everyone in the room arranged as if the world were a portrait. The photographers clicked and whispered, the priest's voice folded into itself like pleats of black cloth. My family practiced secrecy as a kind of craft, and they had taught me to move through exposure with the ease of someone used to being seen as a name. My father had a way of looking at me that cataloged me into heirs and liabilities, and for most of my life I kept my face to match whatever entry he needed. Ava stood opposite me like an annotation. She did not come in a river of silk or bloom like a well-rehearsed bride. She arrived with books under her arm, with a scarf folded in a careful, almost editorial way. She refused bright light the way some people refuse small talk. When the cameras aimed, she slid to the side and readjusted the angle of a lamp so the light would fall on the pages of a footnote rather than on her cheek. The first portrait taken of us, if one could call what the press would later print a portrait, came back as a smear. The gowns and hands readable, the windows and fleur-de-lis of the choir, but her face blurred into a margin of graphite. The photographer swore the lens had jammed. He swore it like a man reporting a misdemeanor. It is embarrassing now to admit how easily that sort of refusal felt like rescue. I had longed in private to be known clumsily and truly, not to be performed any longer as the son of, or the one who will ensure continuity. With Ava, there was a kind of quiet that did not demand spectacle. She taught me to notice the seams of books, to take pleasure in marginalia. Once, on a winter morning, she returned a second-hand volume to me with a slip of paper folded inside. The note read, "Tell me something true about yourself." I remember fumbling for an answer that was not a name, a title, or a duty. I told her I had wanted, still wanted, to be noticed for the small decorative impossibilities of my hands, the way I bent spoons when nervous, the way I could recite half a law in the dark. She laughed once, but it was less laughter than punctuation. She underlined the word small and added in a compact hand, then be small. Courtship with Ava was a private bureaucrat's dream. There were no roses strewn on velvet. There were catalogued exchanges, a late 19th century commentary, a chapter in a worn treatise about charity, the occasional vial of bitter tea she said steadied her stomach when she had to face too many lights. When our families compared notes about engagement parties, they described each other in ledger terms. Guest lists, allocations, lines to be drawn in perpetuity. Theirs was always the language of continuity. Mine finally moved, falteringly, toward something that smelled of margins and ink. She refused for months to be on the family websites meant to announce alliances. When my stepmother suggested a portrait for the society pages, Ava suggested instead that we give a sum to the archive downtown to conserve the record of displaced women artisans. "We will be visible in a different register," she said, and folded her hands. She did not blink when she said it. We were careful people. Even our intimacies came with witnesses. That is what the ledger was for, what the ledgers had always been for in our line, to translate affection into a pattern of obligations so that the house might survive the unforeseen. The household steward was not a person so much as a machine of memory. The back room of the estate smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint rust of the iron safe. Our lawyer, an elderly man with razor-steel spectacles, kept things neat. He spoke like someone used to arriving at verdicts in rooms where future generations were always listening. "There is a clause here," he told me one afternoon, setting a draft on the oak table. He tapped the paper with the exactitude of someone thinning a seam. The prenuptial draft was written partly in a legal hand, partly in a phraseology that looked as if moss had grown over it. I ran my thumb along the margins where an earlier name had once been struck out. The clauses were precise: perpetuity clauses, stewardship clauses, restrictions on sale and transfer. But threaded among them were sentences that read like liturgy. Signature required in the presence of the line for perpetuity. An obligation to hold in trust the name's memorial and to enact, as steward, the rites of visitation. There was language that addressed not only property, but identity. It treated lineal memory as an estate equal in weight to houses and bonds. It called the obligation a covenant, and the word sat in my mind like an accusation. Ava found the ledger folded into a back corner of a desk drawer the night I brought the draft to show her. The room she rented, a narrow flat above a second-hand bookshop, was lit by a single lamp whose glass had been etched with flowers. She spread the pages on the table like one does with pressed leaves. She read in the pauses between sentences as though listening to a train pass. Slow, observant, aware that some noises refract into private histories. When she reached one clause, she did not flinch. She did not look up. "It's older than your family," she said, and when I reached to correct her, she pinned me with an unblinking stare and said, "No, it's older than houses, but your family is very good at dressing it in fine linen." There were in our life brides that preceded us, black and white photographs on the estate walls, their faces not quite in focus, the embroidery of their dresses fossilized in the way older things fossilize, delicately, under glass. We called them the brides of the lineage. They were part accountability, part androgynous praise. An aunt told me once over tea that the brides were witnesses, that their silence made steadier the name. They watched for us, she said, as if watching were an active, faithful labor. Ava would sit before those photographs in the dim hallways and trace the air over a brow. She seemed to accept their presence with something bordering on professional interest. Sometimes she would ask, offhand, did she consent to the portrait? The question was not rhetorical. It had the weight of a legal interrogation, but also the tenderness of someone trying to see a human being where my family saw a token. When the draft's clauses were spelled aloud in the lawyer's office, they sounded less like prose and more like instruction. There is a certain rhythm to bureaucratic language that bends the soul. It reduces urgency to categories. It makes love a ledger entry. "To prevent dispersion," the draft said, "the steward shall ensure—" The man with the spectacles would not meet my eyes. His fingers fanned the pages like a man handling the ribs of a small fish. He explained with the patience of a clerk how the covenant functions, that retention and continuity are achieved by formally naming a keeper, that obligations can be mortgaged to memory, that signature is not merely assent, but the application of a seal. I remember the sound of the ink drying on that day. It was like the sound of a seam being pressed flat. Quiet. Final. Ava laid a hand on the margin where a particular clause sat, and then drew it inward with a pinprick movement, as if closing a seam. Her fingers smelled faintly of lemon and of the paper's dust. She closed the ledger and put it on the top shelf, out of sunlight. "There will always be a steward," she said, and smiled in that precise way of hers, which accepted the fact as if it were a punctuation mark too. The argument in the family went as these arguments do: numbers, legacy, and the language of disaster. My father spoke of the house's obligations to charity, to seats on boards, to the maintenance of the facade that held the name in place. He spoke as if without those threads the house would lose structural integrity. "Perpetuity is not sentiment," he said. "It is safety." His siblings murmured in agreement, cataloging risks and legal contingencies. I sat through that calculus and found myself thinking not of safety, but of the ledger's smell. I was moved as if by an artist, not to see preservation but to feel the weight of being the one who was preserved. Ava surprised them by agreeing to the marriage without consenting to be performed as their steward in the visible sense they expected. She refused the grand role. No foundation inaugurations with speeches, no portraits for the archives. She declared, quietly, and with a voice like a law being read, that she would assume the internal duty of the covenant if it meant the family could reconfigure its outward obligations. It was the sort of bargain that gave my unpracticed tongue a lurch of gratitude and dread. She proposed to take what my family counted on as leverage and to hold it within herself. "I will shoulder the covenant," she said once in the corners of my apartment where only the lamp watched us. "I will be the machine of memory instead of you." To my family, this sounded at first like relief, like a practical reassigning of tasks. To some of them, unimaginative in feeling, it was a concession that had the pleasant architecture of sacrifice without danger. They applauded the arrangement, a private ledger entry that promised to preserve appearances while requiring less of them in the active labor of continuity. They liked the idea of obligations being out of sight as long as obligations were intact. What they did not anticipate, what none of us were prepared for, was the manner of Ava's taking. She did not accept the covenant like a man takes an office. She did not merely sign the dotted line and place a silver seal in an envelope. The covenant, as it existed in our inheritance, was not only a legal instrument but something that remembered. It acted like a mechanism of recording. There are hands in houses like ours that are trained to read the way memory is distributed. The steward's role in old text is nearly a performative one, but in other places it is metaphysical. We had spoken of it in euphemisms because we were decent, because the language of fantasy would scandalize the accountants. The covenant absorbs. The covenant keeps names alight. The covenant must be fed so that the house's voice is not extinguished. Ava did not take it with the theatrical flourish my grandmother expected. She enrolled herself in it with the silence of someone admitting an illness and not wanting to make a scene. She read the ledger's margins as if they were a patient's file. When she said yes at the breakfast table where my mother had decided the seating chart, she did so with a manner that suggested she had already made calculations in a ledger of her own. Costs, benefits, places where pain would be collateral. The decision, when it came, felt like arithmetic. We rehearsed the ceremony several times. The ritual was part priestly, part notary. The officiant, an elderly figure who nourished an unusual facility for ceremony without doctrine, spoke phrases that impressed themselves on the room like stamps. "Do you promise," he intoned, his voice sliding over the vowels like a spoon over a saucer, "to honor the conditions placed by the covenant?" The phrase was both ordinary and peculiar. The steward, an unobtrusive woman who had for decades kept the family safe from the winds of misremembering, sat in the first pew like an archivist holding her breath. The photographers trained themselves as if for a court case, to attend, to record, to silence rumor with clear images. That is why the failure of cameras was so alarming. Not because of vanity, but because of evidence. A photograph, in our circles, is a form of ledger. It binds a face to a date and a narrative. When images refuse to render the bride, when the negative space where her eyes should have been appeared as vellum scraped by time, the room shifted in a manner that no one could entirely account for. The photographer blamed his equipment. The press later called it a technical error. We called it something more fragile, a refusal of the eye to be an instrument. The lead-up to the wedding was a study in controlled anxieties. My cousins rehearsed their smiles, my father rehearsed his speeches, my lawyers rehearsed contingency clauses for contingencies. My own preparation was private and absurdly small, learning to stand long without collapsing into fidgeting, noticing how my pulse sharpened whenever someone glanced at the ledger. Ava carried in her pocket a page torn from a book where a woman had written 3 simple rules. Keep the books, keep your distances, keep the unblinking. Those last words had no religious valence, they were technique. She taught me to fold the corner of a page to mark not the beginning of a chapter, but the point at which I should look away. On the morning, the cathedral smelled of wax and heat, of roses that had been clipped to exactness. There was a ceremony to be performed in which the ledger and the ring would meet. The ring itself was unremarkable to look at. A band of iron rimmed in weathered gold, scratched faintly with the family crest. In our lineage, the ring had the habit of warming when placed against the skin of a designated bearer. The warmth was proverbially referred to as the seal. Some said it indicated agreement. Others said it meant the name was being transferred from ledger to flesh. My father, who had watched generations fold their duty like cloth, did not flinch when the weight of the metal sat in his palm. "It has always done this," he told the gathering. "It recognizes steward." Ava's hands were cool when I slipped the ring onto her finger. The air seemed to hold its breath. I remember the sound the organ made then, an inhalation that went too long. The ring at first was indifferent. Then it warmed in a way that made me step back. It was as if something aware of contracts had found its place and leaned in. The warmth was not pain. It was pressure, like the first fold of a seam being closed. The room blurred at the edges, the faces of my family becoming curlicues of expression I could not parse. There were, tucked in the outer margin of my vision, faces that had no bodies, brides of old, the photographs come undone and stepping out to watch. They were not ghosts in a theatrical sense, more like annotations slipped between the leaves of a book, marginal presences whose job was to testify. For an instant I saw them as the ledger always intended them to be, witnesses whose own signatures had been maintained by other hands. They watched without blinking. Then the steward, the woman who had kept the estate's histories, rose from her pew. Her movement was smooth, as if aware that a chronicle was pivoting. She held a ledger to her chest in the manner of a reliquary. The officiant's voice faltered, and in that crack a clause uncoiled. It was as if legal phrasing had the texture of a muscle, and when it moved it could push air into the room. The ledger's pages, which my lawyer had described in the privacy of his office as archival notes, seemed suddenly more than paper. They were recitations of obligation. Ava did something then that I will not find a satisfactory adjective for. She did not collapse theatrically. She made no dramatic speech. She reached for the ledger the steward held, and when her fingers touched the page, there was a sensation I felt more in my chest than in my eyes. A pressure like someone pressing along the length of a spine, a vibration as if a seam of light had been rubbed with something rough. The organ's chords bent. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the sound could be transcribed as an ink spill, an event that stains and records simultaneously. In that instant, the room attempted to translate the occurrence into several languages. There were murmurs. A few people stood up and then sat down as if obeying an animal's signal. The photographers renewed their clicking, but the flashes blown out the edges of the light like pages singed at the corners. My father, ever the accountant of appearances, looked as if he were calculating losses in his head. My mother had her hand pressed over her mouth, but the expression on her face was spare and unreadable. Ava's face, however, was unreadable in a different way. She did not blink. Her mouth moved once, forming the smallest punctuation of a smile, and then as the steward drew back, she cradled the ledger against her heart with a tenderness that made the air thin. I felt something like gratitude leak through my skin for the strange mercy of an enemy undone in private. My thought, unpoetic and blunt, was, she has taken it into herself. No one could at the time say what that taking meant. The lawyer said later that certain clauses had been activated in a procedural sense. They spoke as if activation were a term in a contract manual and measured themselves again. The press called it an anomalous occurrence at a high-profile wedding. The witnesses were divided between those who swore they had merely seen a woman holding a book and those who insisted something else had passed. Photographs, which might have settled the matter, offered only indeterminate negatives, fields of light and shadow where the ledger had been, a smear where the steward should have been seen, a sudden band of ash gray across the middle of a portrait. It is a strange thing to experience an event that resists documentary validation. My family attempted, in the weeks following, to quiet the conversation in the only language it understood, ledger language. Contracts were ratified, press statements were drafted, the house's endowments were quietly rerouted. There were practical consequences that pleased the accountants. People who had expected perpetual access to the household's channels of influence found themselves politely told they would have to apply through the new offices the family established. My father, to his credit, turned his ledger work to a flurry of philanthropy as if that could contain what had happened. But there were also intimacies that reorganized themselves. Ava did not become an object of spectacle after the event. She withdrew in the public sense from foundation openings and from the platform of our name. She moved with a limp, or perhaps only with the economy of someone who has been asked to carry too much. Letters came to me from friends abroad. "We saw in the papers," they wrote, not knowing what else to say. The tone of their sentences was like fingernails against glass. What I could not for a long time make fit into the ledger's categories was the precise private sensation of how the covenant seemed to alter the air around her. At night in our small rooms, she would read aloud to me from marginalia she loved. She would close the book and say, "It remembers me," and I would be foolish enough to assume she meant simply the act of being read. Sometimes when we lay side by side, I felt as if the house's past, its obligations, its names, pressed like a cool weight along the contours of her shoulder. It was not an ugly image. It resembled those small, necessary acts of caretaking that we mistake for devotion, tucking a page back into a book, smoothing a hem, holding a ledger upright so it does not slip. Not everyone saw her that way. There were those who whispered that she had taken something from us. There were others who called her a monster in language so polite it left no scandal to be written about. Another kind of steward, a columnist wrote, a woman who absorbs rather than releases. The phrase not human began, in gossip, as hyperbole. But hyperbole is dangerous. It is the flat knife that severs feeling from ethical substance. I resented it then and now. To call her not human was to convert what she did into spectacle and to strip from it the dignity of intention. Ava kept a private archive after the wedding. She collected letters she had never sent, receipts for small gifts she had made to strangers, pressed newspapers that described the world in tones she found telling. She paid visits to the bookshop below her flat and read to the owner, an elderly woman who claimed to be bored by the news. "You cannot keep everything," the owner told her once, folding a newspaper as if into a hand. "Some things must be let go." Ava looked at her with the look she always reserved for paradoxes and said quietly, "But what if someone must be the place that keeps them?" There were nights I would wake and imagine ledgers rustling in the dark, the sound more audible than rain. I would think of the bridal portraits on the walls, their faces pale as envelopes. I would try to remember the texture of her skin before the wedding, as if it were a book cover I might return to and tuck a corner. Memory is a ledger, too. It keeps, and it erases. My entries for a long while were sparse. The house, predictably, rearranged itself. Men who had expected favors found their access politely rerouted through new bureaucracies. The charity boards we controlled were renamed and recast. The family made statements in newspapers about transitioning responsibilities and honoring commitments in new forms. My cousins, who had been raised to bend to the shape of a name, took to phoning people and insisting on continuity. The steward, whose presence had been alterable until that day, fell into the background and then out of sight. She wrote a letter once that circulated in the inner envelope. Her death had been polite and private, she said, a wrapping up of old accounts. Her absence made room. What my family attempted again and again was to domesticate the unmanageable into ledgers and press releases. But some things refused domesticating. The ledger that had been kept in the steward's hands had other properties. It was less a contract than a living index, or so it seemed to me when I would sit with Ava in a room above a bookshop and she would read from its margins as if reciting a prayer. She would move her finger along a line and then look at me and say, "Do you see how memory organizes itself? It is jealous. It demands custodianship." I would answer with the ordinary language of consolation and then think privately of my own hunger, that I had wished to be seen as more than a name. We were not dramatic in our romance. Our courtship had the awkward politeness of two people who had been trained to be conscious of being observed. We held hands in corners out of sight. We traded small tokens. A note folded with a margin quoted, a pressed bloom from a garden she refused to have her wedding bouquet plucked from because she'd never liked the idea of stealing a plant's life for spectacle. She preferred small kindnesses. A loaf of bread brought at dawn to an old man in the neighborhood, an extra candle sent to the church for the worker who cleaned the pews. Those acts, in the ledger of the mind, accumulated into a different kind of credit. But there was always at the back of my awareness the ledger she had taken from the steward. It hummed like a machine that remembers mechanically, but with a tenderness that bordered on cruelty. There were afternoons when I thought I saw the house's obligations folding themselves into her shadow. It made me uneasy to watch the thing that had once been external become internal. It made me grateful in a way that was shameful. To be worthy of such an act, was that love, or was it the illusion of being liberated from one's name? The weeks leading to the wedding were full of small rehearsed gestures and of the unsaying of things. The lawyer, as ever, arrived with a clear-eyed appetite for contingency. He told me, with the softness of someone reading a will, that once certain phrases were read aloud in the presence of witnesses, their status would change. He spoke of signatures as if they were not merely quills but small miracles. "We are not magicians," he said. "We are custodians of instruments that altered circumstance by their form. They do what they do because they are shaped to. Whether we think that shape is right, that is another question." I remember the night before the wedding, how the house seemed full of its old respirations, the muffled dance of servants, the tea clinking in the silver room. I cannot tell whether the dread I felt was for myself or for the artifice we were about to perform. There is a small cruelty in ancestral obligations. They make choices in you before you have become able to make them yourself. Ava sat on the narrow windowsill of her room and read aloud a line from a book about margins. "There are people who live in the in-between," she said. "They are not visible until you need them." That sentence has remained with me because later its edges would be the only shelter I could cling to when the ledger's consequences unfolded. She pressed the book to her chest as if to test the firmness of words against flesh. The next day, when we stood beneath the stone arches and I saw that she did not blink, the smallness I had yearned for in her became a monstrous gravity to others. The newspapers would later form their headlines around that image. A few reporters, generous in a way I did not appreciate until later, tried to understand. Most did not. Most treated the event as a derailment in the social calendar and wrote it up as an oddity. I married her. The sentence sits easiest in my mouth when I keep my hands busy. A book's margin, the handle of a kettle. In the saying of it, I mean more than the performance of a social arrangement. I mean that I consented, in private, to be seen as less a name and more the person who stood with her in the doorway of a life. The act of marriage in our world has many registers: legal, social, aesthetic. The one that mattered to me was the private, ordinary one. Tea in the morning, the sharing of small tasks, learning to be present for someone else without the family ledger translating every good into duty. I had lived my life in a way that expected performance. With Ava, for the first time, I wanted a life without a script. If this sounds naive, it should. I like to think I had disentangled myself from my inheritance. The decades of practice and ritual, however, had a way of clasping you back. When the ledger moved then, it felt as if an old machine began to whir into operation again. The activation, when it came, was not cinematic. It was not thunderous. It was a recalibration, a fine reweaving of threads. But because it involved the steward's absence and the steward's ledger, because it involved the ring and a seam of light and people who had been trained to produce evidence, it became something else in the public imagination. A failure, a comedic grotesque, a scandal. My wedding went terribly wrong, the headlines declared in tones both amused and triumphant. The bride who wasn't human, such phrases make good copy. They make good copy because they avoid the harder sentence, the bride who chose. If a clause can be a choice, then what she did was to choose. That is the difficulty of the moment I keep returning to. To call her action anything but choice is to rob it of moral weight. She might have allowed the covenant to translate itself outward, to be performed by me in ceremonies and speeches, to be the visible steward of a name. Instead, she took it inside, and in doing so, made myself and my family have to reckon with what continuity costs. There is a dignity in that refusal that our newspapers never captured. The aftermath, for the family, was both bureaucratic and personal. We spun financial mechanisms into new forms. We issued statements that transformed the event into planned transition. My father negotiated quietly to prevent rumor from compromising the house's credit. There was an old-fashioned canniness to his grief. He had always been capable of calculating loss as a ledger entry and then acting as if the arithmetic would make sense of sorrow. My mother sewed quietly and refused to be photographed for weeks. My cousins spun conspiracy theories about inheritance and insurance. All of them, in different ways, were practicing the old craft of turning outrage into procedure. But not everything can be shown in a bank statement. The alterations to our interior lives, the way that small domestic routines came to stand in for the big pageant, were not legible in the columns of ledgers and balance sheets. There is a slow pedagogy to living without the assumption of automatic privilege. Learning to stand in line for bread, to apologize for taking a cab, to let a shop assistant name a discount without checking whether the name of your house had carried precedence. Those were humiliations and lessons alike. They were, in ways I had not expected, sometimes healthier than I had anticipated. Ava, for her part, retreated from the public functions and retreated not into a fortress, but into the small domesticities that had always been her preference. She repaired books in the back room of the shop beneath her flat. She brewed teas for the owner and for the odd stray who needed a warm hand. She wrote letters that she did not send and left them in the pockets of donated coats. She would take my hand in the market and, without theatrics, ask me if I wanted a loaf or an apple. Those moments, so mundane they almost refuse narrative, were the ones that remade us. There were, of course, those who wanted a tidy explanation. The more sensible members of society suggested neurological conditions, malfunctions, and the like. The more credulous wanted miracles. I want to avoid both. My account is not a trial, and it is not an explanation. It is a witness from a person who entered complicity with certain inheritance patterns, and, in the process, was changed by a woman's decision to make herself a repository of what we had been taught to value. The ledger's mechanics remain opaque to me. They were always designed to be so. To say otherwise would be to convert mystery into proof and pry open the delicate dignity of the choice she made. When I think back now to the moment she took the ledger and to the way it felt like paper being folded into a body, I am ashamed of the mixture of gratitude and selfishness that rose in me. I was grateful to be relieved of a social machine that would have grieved me into decreed identity. I was selfish because part of me liked having a problem solved by someone else's sacrifice. That admixture, gratitude spoiled by guilt, is a ledger entry I have learned to carry and to read. The first block of my life with her after the ceremony was an apprenticeship in the ordinary. We learned the arts of small talk in shops, the art of waiting without the habit of entitlement. I learned that being present is an active verb. It requires a body willing to sit with small discomforts. She learned, perhaps, that being a steward is not only about keeping memory, but about living among the living. We rebuilt a private schedule, mornings with newspapers, afternoons with marginalia, evenings with tea. There was a long, slow reconfiguration that began at the moment the ring warmed and would not finish in a season. If you like slow-burning tales about power and choice, subscribe. Even as the public story formed itself into headlines and into the periodic curiosity of certain papers, there remained in our house a quieter set of currencies. Small mercies, irritation, the occasional outburst of laughter. Haunted by the old brides in photographs, we took to hanging different portraits on the walls, landscapes and still lifes, things that could not be read as testimony. We rearranged the library so that new books sat there like little acts of defiance. The ledgers, when they needed to be consulted, were handled differently. My family still practiced the rituals of continuity, but with a new awkwardness. They had to make moral calculations where once habit had simply settled. People asked her, privately and sometimes cruelly, whether she had lost herself in taking the covenant. They meant to ask whether she had been diminished. She, to her credit, refused to allow that question to be the only way to speak of her act. She insisted, when she could bear it, that taking the ledger did not erase her. She taught me to fold corners on the pages of certain books, and to leave the turned corners like small beacons for someone else who might need to find a sentence. She would say, with a small sharp pleasure, that there is a method to saving, not to hoard, but to keep in a way that is generous. I do not know at what point the rest of the world began to accept that our wedding had altered the shape of things. Banks ate their losses, alliances rearranged, the elderly charitable committees of which we were nominal heads reconstituted themselves under new bylaws. The family found, grudgingly, that openness and the performance of obligation are not precisely the same. Some influence cooled, some persisted. We began, slowly, to live as if the need to be seen as the estate could be shifted into small acts of kindness rather than into grand performative events. And yet, even as the world outside re-encoded the event into its own categories, in my own rooms the ledger's presence was palpable as a seam running through our days. I would wake and hear, faintly, the rustle of paper, a sound that could either be memory or the mind's invention of memory. Ava would sometimes read aloud marginal notes from the pages the steward had given her, and then fold the paper with an affection that made my hands start to ache. I began to understand that the covenant, taken inward, did not simply disappear. It became a living, difficult thing that asked for tending. The months following the ceremony taught me a vocabulary of small repair. I learned to bargain at the market instead of assuming precedence. I discovered the pleasure of being mistaken for an ordinary person, of having a clerk look me in the face rather than glance at the crest on my card. There is a kind of liberty in such humiliations. It forces you into attention, to learn small courtesies without the assumption of deference. There is a kind of liberty in being overlooked, in having to ask for the price on the chalkboard. It forces the body to be present. After the wedding, the days arranged themselves into a curriculum of small reckonings. I learned to queue without an attendant's patience guiding the line. I learned to accept that the clerk at the bakery did not know my name and did not owe me a story. The first time I paid for a loaf without a discount handed by a family crest, I felt my palms go slightly cold, as if I were being measured again, only this time by someone who did not own the scales. It was a modest humiliation and perversely a relief. The ledger of my life had been stripped of its polite extras. I discovered what the base account read when the format was simpler. Ava arranged our mornings like a set of small experiments in ordinary steadiness. She woke before me and put the kettle on, the motion as quiet as folding a corner of a page. She would stand by the sink with a cloth draped over her hand and watch the light change on the windowsill. I would make tea badly at first, too long steeped, too little leaves, and she would take the cup, blow at it once, and hand it back. There was a density to those moments that rivaled any ceremony I had been taught to perform. They carried no witnesses, but carried everything. She returned to the bookshop where her flat hung above the back room like a small attic of possibilities. The owner, a woman with cataracts and a precise memory for odd facts, kept 2 chairs by the radiator for us. The back room smelled of glue and dust and the faint tang of lemon where Ava had trained herself to clean binding edges. She repaired books with the economy of someone who understood that mending is a kind of preservation not merely in service of memory, but in service of other people. She would stitch counters of thread along cracked spines, press pages back into levers of sense. Customers came in with tears in hand, a paperback with a child's name scrawled in the margin, a recipe book with pages missing, and Ava would accept them, tuck them into the folds of her day, and return them made whole in a way that had nothing to do with signatures or endowments. We kept no formal calendar for charity. We found ourselves performing small acts that once would have been the province of the estate's name, a check quietly written to a food bank, an unannounced payment to cover a neighbor's heating bill. My father responded to these changes with a particular kind of thrifted fury. He could not treat benevolence as accounting. He convened meetings in the drawing room where he laid out budgets and asked perplexed questions about who would oversee the distribution. It was, for him, a problem that required a ledger. My mother, who had never liked fuss, took to making soup for the elderly woman who lived down the lane and refused to let anyone take charge of the arrangement on paper. They both tried, in different languages, to domesticate what had to Ava knee. One with rules, the other with food. There were moments when my complicity sat in my throat like bad ink. It is no small thing to have someone take on a cost so you may live differently. There were mornings I woke with guilt, like a weight in my ribs. At times, I found myself resenting the ease with which certain inconveniences were removed from me. Now that she had borne the covenant's shape internally, I could walk away from the mechanisms that had once tied me. I tried to compensate in small ways, by taking on errands, by learning to stand up for slow service at municipal offices, by pretending the changes were not the product of a bargain in which my privacy had been paid for by another person's acceptance of a strange burden. Those attempts were clumsy and often inadequate. Ava, for her part, bore the ledger like an old scar in a woman who has learned to live with a healed bone. She was both present and remote. There were hours when she spoke to me about marginalia with an animation that made her eyes seem tender and luminous, and other times when she would sit very still and hold a folded page to her lips in a way that suggested communion rather than spectacle. When she laughed now, it was a small, exact sound that never ventured into the full-throated public laughter my family performed at dinner parties. People whispered about her reserve. Some called it a dignity. Others called it coldness. I saw in it something more complicated. She had made herself a place for memory, and the place was heavy. There were practical things to be settled. The family restructured its foundations. Boards were reconstituted with new charters and fresh names. Lawyers, who had once been architects of continuity, became mediators of reduction. My father's accounts were audited and reshelved into philanthropy that read better in grant applications. Certain acquaintances who assumed the household's largesse found it narrower. There were meetings where old commitments were politely renegotiated or allowed to expire. For some people, this was a financial inconvenience. For others, it was a profound loss. The house's network loosened like a net with a strand removed. Fewer invitations, fewer names on lists, a decline in the steady hum of influence. Yet the town benefited in faint, practical ways. A community center received funds to repair its roof. A scholarship was instituted not with fanfare but with deliberate anonymity. The press inevitably returned to the story in cycles. At first, the coverage had been gossipy and cruel, full of phrases about the strange bride and malfunctions. Over time, a few more thoughtful pieces appeared. Essays from cultural critics who tried to deconstruct what it meant for a private covenant to be taken inward and what it might signal about the hold of lineage over the living. A journalist once wrote that our wedding exposed the invisible architecture of privilege. His paragraph was generous enough to recognize choice rather than only pathology. Still, the tabloids continued to picture her as an aberration. Photographs continued to fail in odd ways when they tried to capture her. Smears, negatives overexposed, a kind of photographic reluctance. Sometimes I suspected the film was simply old or inept. Other times it looked as if the world refused to record that which declined performance. There were legal aftershocks, too. Requests arrived for the textualization of what had been activated. Filings for the instrument's status, petitions from distant cousins seeking clarification, a quiet inquiry from a regulatory body that wondered if a covenant of such peculiar diction could be construed in current statutory terms. My lawyer, who had the awkward tenderness of someone who had spent his life redacting sentiment into clause, arranged meetings with committees, read passages aloud in the same measured voice he always adopted. They debated whether the act of absorption had rendered the obligation unenforceable, or whether it had instead created a private trust of indeterminate scope. Their conversations were precise and valueless to the true ethical problem. What does it mean to ask a person to be the repository of your memory? On one particularly dull afternoon, my father invited me to the library and slid a thin envelope across the table. Inside was a line of accounts. How much had been redirected to various causes, how the endowment now operated under a board with independent oversight, draft language to ensure that the house's name was honored without compulsory performance. He did this with the economy of a man who hoped paperwork could be an apology. I thanked him without grace. He asked if I was all right. I said yes, and then left to find Ava repairing the spine of a cookbook for a woman who had saved for months to have her father's recipes preserved. She had changed, materially and immaterially. Her hands carried new veining from hours of mending. Her voice sometimes wavered when she read aloud marginal notes that had belonged to women who had been erased from lineage lists. Yet she also displayed an irony that cut through sentiment. Once, when a local columnist wrote that she had rendered herself unhuman, she clipped the paragraph and pasted it to a page in a scrapbook, underlining the word with a pen that had no sentiment. "Not human," she said to me when I lifted the scrapbook cover, "is a phrase meant to make people comfortable with cruelty." She tapped the sentence as if offering punctuation, then closed the book. We had arguments about language, about the phrase absorption, about whether the covenant had taken her or whether she had taken it. I tended to speak in grammar that minimized her agency. She corrected me, often with the same blunt, scholastic tenderness she used when marking passages in books. "You make me small when you say I was taken," she told me once, refolding the napkin on the table. I took it. I chose the ledger the way someone chooses a lifetime of care. I was ashamed then and now at how easily I had framed her as passive. She refused that narrative. It was one of the first lessons she pressed on me with a clarity that left no loophole for romantic vanity. The moral center of a choice lies in the chooser, not in the one who benefits. Still, In the small hours, I wrestled with a private ledger of gratitude and guilt. There were times I walked the lanes and pretended not to remember the size of the bargain struck. There were nights I dreamed of the steward's hand closing the ledger against a breast and felt in my dream the weight of the book pressing down. I would wake and count, in my head, the small kindnesses I had given, as if tallying could atone. It did not. Only small, persistent acts of presence did. The public's curiosity cooled as new stories rose in their place. But in private circles, the incident had a slow afterlife. The brides on the walls remained part of our household rituals, but we began to reframe them. Instead of hanging framed portraits that testified to lineage, we placed anonymous landscapes and simple studies of still life. We replaced the formal wedding photographs with images of hands folding paper, hands with book dust in the creases, hands holding loaves. The change was symbolic, and symbols matter. There were evenings, my favorites, when we would walk to the market with no plan and buy a single pepper or 2 oranges, and then come home to make soup. She would stand at the counter and peel the skin in a long, precise motion. Her fingers moved like someone reversing and repairing a seam. She taught me how to notice the simple arc of a peel falling like a ribbon to the table. She taught me to value the way the light struck fruit in the crate, rather than the way it struck me when I was announced in rooms. I have carried those lessons into my hands. A year passed, and with it, the soft erosion of certain intensities. The house's public obligations had been distributed, the family asked fewer favors of others, and we learned to be less automatic in our assumptions. Ava continued her quiet guardianship of things that mattered to no one but the people who required memory. Letters saved in shoeboxes, recipes that had no publication value, a ledger of names of artisans whose work the estate had once co-opted. She annotated all these with a fine, clear hand. On the anniversary of the wedding, my father wanted to rehearse a speech I had never written. He asked for a small family gathering in the same cathedral where the event had taken its odd turn. I resisted at first. Such places rattled things open for me, but Ava was insistent. There is a difference between the place where the ledger worked and the place where we hold ourselves now, she said. We have been given an opportunity to come back on our own terms. She did not use rhetoric. She used the simple grammar of care. We entered the cathedral in quiet. The stone was like a page unread for a long time. Its air was slow. The light came through stained glass like a kind of ink spilled across the floor. People watched us with that mediated attention that the successful have learned to expect. My cousins arranged themselves so they could be seen and not seen simultaneously. My father tucked his hands into pockets as if to keep his accounts from fluttering. The organ hummed in a mode of memory. It was the same instrument, but the room had changed because we had. She did not blink more than she ever had that day. But in the pause before she asked her question, she reached for my hand. The ring I had placed on her finger had been repaired once by a jeweler who said nothing of its warming tendencies. It had been softened by repeated daily use. It looked now like an ordinary band showing years of gentle abrasion. She held my fingers and, with the same directness she used for a marginal note, looked at me and asked, "Would you choose me without a contract?" The question was utterly ordinary in its phrasing and enormous in what it demanded. It was not the sort of thing a grand speech could answer. It proposed a conversion from institutional obligation to personal intention. It asked whether the quiet we had learned to practice could survive the public eye, whether my gratitude could find its way into continued action. I felt for a moment the ledger's old pressure, a weight of expectation that my answer would be performative, an entry to be recorded. I knew then that any honest response would not be a line in a book, but a course of living. I answered with a simple inventory instead of a rhetoric. I told her I would choose her for the ways she taught me to fold the edges of my life into something neat and tender, for the mornings when she handed me a cup and the world felt less raw, for the nights when she held letters to her chest and did not make show of her sorrow. I told her I would choose her for the parts of her that had nothing to do with the ledger, and for the part she had taken on to protect my family from themselves. She listened as if she were reading a marginal note I had written hastily, and somehow with love. She smiled then, not as a monument, but in a way that revealed something private, a tiny movement of the mouth that was not an act of agreeing to be seen, but a decision to let herself be known. I do not recall her blinking at that precise second. Memory will shade that detail with ambiguity. What remains clear is that the question had been asked without the scaffolding of obligation and answered without a formal clause. We came away from the cathedral differently that day. There was no public pronouncement, no renewed ceremony, but there was an internal rearrangement. Choosing her had never been a one-time legal operation. It was an ongoing ledger and a different kind of account-keeping. To choose someone without a contract is to accept the tedium of care, the payment of attention, the willingness to be grindstone rather than herald. It is to accept small losses and the fact that gratitude will sometimes be complicated by selfishness. In the years since, we have practiced this kind of choosing. We have learned to apologize quickly and to not hide mistakes behind statements of noble intent. I have taken on chores that once would have been designated to staff, sorting the mail in the evening, cleaning a narrow brass lamp that used to be the responsibility of a housekeeper. She, in turn, allows me to be less brave than I would have been in the face of social collapse. She refuses to let my guilt become a reason to withdraw. We argue about trivialities and avoid performance. We compose letters we will not send. We mend and we fold, and sometimes we fail. People who have not lived the removal of automatic privilege cannot always recognize the small bravery of mundanity. The press occasionally returns to the wedding as an oddity or a parable, and writers will assign a moral that suits their purpose. Some readers will take the story as a cautionary tale about lineage. Others will extract from it a romantic fable of selflessness. Neither of those captures the truth. The truth sits in the slow work of daily accounting, what we do for one another when no ledger watches. Ava remained most of all a person. She read, she repaired, she tasted teas and scowled at bad poems. She had moments of sharp humor and moments of deep weariness. There were afternoons when I would watch her from across a small kitchen, her profile like a precise line from a favored book, and think that if everything undone itself tomorrow, she would still be the woman I chose, independent of any seal or clause. She had not become less human by taking on memory. She had become more complicatedly human by refusing a ritual that expected her to perform for a name. When people asked me, with the double curiosity of friends and strangers, whether I had been saved by her act, I always flinched. There is a cheapness to the narrative that would transform sacrifice into a simple currency that buys redemption. The bargain we made was not between sinner and saint. It was between two people trying to live more honest lives. To call her a savior is to defer to spectacle. To call her merely an archivist is to deny her personhood. She was and remains both and neither. An agent who chose, a woman who carried, a life that rewrote the terms of ours. What we traded in that moment of absorption was not only social capital but the comfort of inherited ease. That cost lingers. There are anniversaries when the stream of old obligations rises in memory and asks for accounting. There are also mornings when a stranger in a shop thanks me for not taking for granted the courtesy given, a kindness offered as if I were any other person, and I find my face warming with something that is neither pride nor shame, but the clarity of being seen then seen again. To live without a contract is to learn new rituals. We designed our own small ones, noting the birthdays of neighbors, answering letters that did not bear a request for money, attending a community meeting where decisions were taken by people who knew the problems by name rather than by association. These are modest liturgies. They do not make headlines. They do not attract donors because they are not easily packaged. But they make a life. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the old portraits look like unread pages, I will take down one of the albums and look at a photograph of us from before the wedding. Hands, the hesitant tilt of a smile, the hem of a dress, as if to calibrate the distance between then and now. The images are imperfect witnesses, blurs, smudges, the occasional overexposed flare where the ring glows like a mistaken punctuation. They are useful for humility. They remind me that what we did was not simply a single heroic gesture, but a set of ongoing choices that must be renewed. There are moments when people still ask whether Ava is back or better. The question, inherently, misunderstands the point. Recovery is not a return to a previous state. It is the invention of new habits. When she does laugh fully now, without reserve, I feel a lightness that is not absent of complexity. It carries the memory of weight and the wisdom of endurance. Sometimes she will pause in conversation and press a thumb against the edge of a book, marking a place she wants to return to. Those gestures, small and habitual, are her way of tending the ledger she chose to keep. I married her. I say those words now without the tremor that once accompanied them. They have been worn smooth by years of living. They mean to me not only that we entered a legal arrangement, but that we made a pact of daily attention and ordinary fidelity. The wedding went, in many eyes, terribly wrong. It failed the expectations of a social calendar. It ruptured a tidy performance. The bride who wasn't human in the tabloids was a caricature that flattened a choice into a spectacle. The real truth is neither neatly scandalous nor simplistically noble. It is the patient work of choosing a person without instruments of compulsion and the slow, sometimes lonely labor of living out that decision. If you have thoughts about what it would mean to unbind an inheritance in your own life, I would like to hear them. Check out the playlist for other stories that examine the small economies of belonging and the ethics of intimacy. Leave a comment. Tell me what choice would cost you. We do not end with a moral triumph. There is no tidy expiation, no complete renunciation of the past. The house is still my house in certain formal ways. My family still exists with its gratitudes and fails. But we learned that continuity can be practiced in smaller, less spectacular forms. That a name need not be the axis of a life. That tending to one another, making tea, repairing spines, standing in line without privilege, carries moral weight. The ledger, for my part, remains an object on a shelf, a material thing that once determined trajectories. Ava reads its margins sometimes and hums as if the letters were old music. I listen, and in the listening I keep choosing her again.